Good evening, everyone. It's a pleasure to welcome you to the first Berlage Keynotes of our spring semester, which is an ongoing lecture series featuring internationally prominent architects, designers, and thinkers who are at the forefront of design discourse and innovation. This semester, we've invited a selection of speakers working from different disciplinary perspectives and in different geographic, cultural, and political contexts to present how their work engages with contemporary issues and debates. It's a pleasure to welcome Emanuel Christ, partner of the Basel-based Christ Gantenbein, founded in 1998 by Emanuel and his partner Christoph Gantenbein. The firm's completed projects include the expansion and transformation of the Swiss National Museum in Zurich, the extension of the Kunsthal, the Kunstmuseum in Basel, and most recently, the headquarters for the Lindt and Sprüngli chocolate factory in Zurich. Currently, the firm is working on a range of projects across Europe, including a housing development in Paris, an office building in Germany, the extension of the museum in Cologne, and the Zurich University Hospital, along with a housing and office building in the historic center of Hamburg. Alongside the practice, Emanuel and Christoph also hold a chair at the ETH Zurich, where they basically teach an architecture and, well, I would say even urban design studio. I don't know if that's the proper phrasing of it, but it's a pleasure to have Emanuel back at the Berlage to not only present the, let's say, work in progress of the office, but also to share with us some of their academic work, what they're doing at the ETH in terms of research on past, present, and future building typologies, and how, well, and I hope that at the end of the lecture, we'll be able to maybe have a discussion of how maybe there's a link between that kind of academic work and the work of the office, and how thinking is mutually linked. Yeah, at any rate, it's a pleasure to give the screen to you, Emanuel. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Solomon. Thanks a lot. Hi, everyone. I'm very, very happy to be back at the Berlage. Has been a while. Obviously under slightly different or different circumstances. However, thanks a lot for the invitation. I'm very happy to share a few thoughts and also, of course, some content of our academic and practical work with you in the coming minutes or in the next hour or so. So, as you said, it has been a while. Solomon and I, we know each other. I don't know, it goes back more than 10 years for sure. And we had this common ground of, actually, I would say, urban research through the eyes or the lens of an architect. So the relationship between the built territory and the architectonic artifact being somehow the center of the interest. And somehow I might maybe come back to that. You will see that in a moment. So my lecture has been announced as work in progress, the typical title you give when you do not know what you will speak about, since the invitation comes so early. I'm very glad I accepted the invitation. I'm also very glad I chose this title because it made me think of that progress. Whether it's progress or not, we can't see, but at least there is a process, there is elapsing time, and somehow I was sort of referring to that when I was preparing my thoughts and my slides for the two-day presentation. And it actually goes back to the 10th of November in 2009, when I was introduced by Salomon at the Berlage Institute, still in Rotterdam at the time. And my lecture was probably announced as recent work, or no, one current under construction, I think it was under construction. But then I gave the lecture a title, and that title was Plans. That was the slide from the time. And I started to speak about the plan as the essential element of, or tool maybe, of the architect. I was speaking about, I didn't listen to it, so maybe it's wrong, but it was about the beauty and the fascination of the plan. It was about the plan being or representing the essence of a project, of a building, its structure, its space, its tectonics, a fantastic condensation of information in one two-dimensional drawing. All the possible reasons why and how we can imagine and guess that we read in the plan. There is the relationship of the building represented in the plan and to its neighbor. It's a relationship between a building and the city that we can read or start to understand through the logic of a plan, like in this example. So all these plans, I showed them 11 years ago, but since most of the audience, Salomon, is probably a bit fresher than us, I thought, why not showing the plans again, you know? You know, the plan speaking of how we live in a building. So it is somehow, it contains the script of a scenario. A plan is not only a plan how to build and how to put architectonical elements together, but it is a plan about how to move through a space and how to use it. There is another very, very condensed example that actually almost expresses a symbolic value as such. It's a sign. The plan is a sign. It is the ultimate architectonic or architectural representation. However, that was probably more or less what I tried to say as an introduction to a building that was a housing or is a housing building, trying to vary the system of one type along its development. But that has been published since many times. However, now it's a different date. It's a couple of years later. And I thought the title for this lecture could be More Plans. So since I felt obliged to represent an idea of progress, so I come with more plans. This is a set of drawings that we produced in our research team at ETH. It is sort of a matrix, a collection of drawings that we made after our research on typological research on ordinary buildings, in this case in Athens. So it's part of a bigger research project that actually started short. That's interesting, at least for myself, that started short after this lecture and exchange that we had at the time at the Berlage. The fascination for the drawings, for the interest in the plan and trying to understand what the plan means, what information it contains, and how much it can tell us about a building and its relationship to the city became a sort of an obsessive investigation that took us to many places on the planet. And this, as I said, is Athens. And of course, a plan in itself is nothing, we could argue. The plan is almost a code for much more. And of course, if you look at this series, I didn't even count this roughly 40 or so buildings that we see here. They are chosen examples from a much wider range of buildings. They are not famous, they are pretty normal. They are rather the opposite. They are ordinary buildings that stand for the big mass of the modern city that is not an orthodox modern city, but maybe rather the unorthodox modern city, the normal case, as we called it, where density and urban qualities that never fundamentally changed since the Middle Ages were still reproduced in a way through patterns that were let's say, defined by the circumstances of 20th century history. So yes, there are more plans, but of course the plans speak of buildings in Athens in this case. I just give you a few photographs that are showing you that in the end, a plan is just one floor of a whole building that can step back, that can evolve in different directions. And of course, the buildings, they relate to each other. As I said, they are forming crossroads. They're standing on a corner. They meet or they don't meet. They leave open these wonderful, beautiful party walls, blind, blank party walls. And they are partly more structure or even infrastructure than an actual building, like this wonderful parking lot on the left, or the housing then on the right. And here we see that it is Athens indeed. And of course, all the architects, us included, traveled for the Parthenon at some point in their life and career. But actually what we found much more interesting is it's the sea of houses around the Parthenon that was the subject of our research, because we found that there is a quality, and I'm even tempted to say a beauty in this everyday architecture. It was around the moment, it was actually not so long after the financial crisis that we went there, and still we could see and exchange with our generations of architects and students who were starting to also get interested again in that structure that they had to use in a different way. Of course, there is different versions to it and so on. So the plan stands for the building stands for an idea of a city, the building offers a space in the context of a whole. Nevertheless, we then took these drawings or these plans and tried to understand. So we went really to see and to find archival material to measure. And I will not speak about every single building. I rather run through a few drawings, where then we understand that the plan is only the base for a three-dimensional understanding, of course. So I was speaking about the party wall, the logic of the building, the plan that forms a corner to two sides, the plan of a building that stands completely free and fills a full block, different ways of using the corner or a lot like this one. This is a garage. There are many garages. That's the fascinating thing in Athens, that ultimately you have housing, office, garages, because that was to a good extent built in the 60s and the 70s. It's not informal settlement, and still there was not much planning. The interesting thing is, one could argue, there is the whole variety of urban use in the same type of a building. Of course, there are variations. Of course, sometimes there are balconies more articulated, sometimes less articulated. But somehow the DNA, the inherent structure to the building, which actually is the building structure, is pretty much always the same. And this has to do with means of production, economy, and technology. You see, so it's more than 40, I guess. I go very quick. We always can come back if there is a question to one of these building types. You see, some of them are very regular, freestanding, almost like a temple, a modern temple of the everyday. Some are much more specific. And again, the underlying principle in a way goes back to this, and I think it was our friend and colleague, Pierre Aureli, who described the urbanism of Athens in a book where he referred then also to the Domino System by Le Corbusier. And in a way, that's what's beautiful about Athens. It's a sort of a modernist, even a later modernist version of or a Mediterranean modern version of Parisian urbanism, where just one type of houses are set one next to the other. However, we put that together, and I'm sharing this with you just to give you a bit an indication how we started to build up a way of looking at the world of architecture, how we tried to establish a structure in documenting, in reading, documenting, and ultimately using this information, because we believe that making architecture has a lot to do with looking at buildings, studying examples. It's a very humble and modest and absolutely not new approach, I think, but strangely enough, by doing so, by studying, by researching and investigating, by finding ways of how to represent what we observe, we start and engage with a new design every time we're doing that. And in that sense, I consider it, at least that's my position, to be maybe discussed afterwards in the debate. This is a very contemporary way of bringing forward our discipline and our profession, and ultimately our environment. So here you see just a few pages spread from that research, the chapter of Athens, then also Sao Paulo, as you could see, was there. That was a mistake. However, look, this is on the left-hand side. You see, for example, bottom left, and we saw it. I mean, this is a strange plan. Look how beautiful this plan is. There is, I'm speaking about the one bottom left. There is this opening, kind of like fan-like plan, the floor plate, opening obviously on a soft corner with one column in the center, a little staircase and a lift, and that's it. I mean, this is very pragmatic, very intelligent, very economical, and at the same time so beautiful. It is so hierarchical. That's why I find it beautiful. It is celebrating the presence of one column in one space. It is celebrating that there is a street front and the back. It's celebrating that there is tension in the geometry of two non-parallel walls. It is celebrating, at least in my reading, the presence of an asymmetric movement through the floor, where you then reach the staircase and you spiral down or up. So, and yes, there is a little cupboard, a piece of infrastructure in the other corner where you would have the toilets. I mean, this is sort of the most perfect minimal house I could think of. I mean, I'm making a bit the case. It is sort of trying to engage with you guys, reading these drawings. So again, here we have these plans that I brought for today's lecture. I could go on forever on many of those. These things have been published. In that sense, this is something. Here, look, that's the garage. Do you see the top right one here? 2 car lifts, again, 1 column. I mean, that's minimal conceptual art almost. Or the other one down here, there is a ramp. That's a ramp. Do you see my arrow? Yeah. And then you gain the floor. And I mean, it's not, there is so little space, but apparently at some point in history, it was worth it. It was, economically speaking, viable to build such a small plot, to offer a few parking lots per floor, and it was an economy. Maybe after, and that's one of the essential statements of that lecture, after a certain time, it might be that the cars are not needed anymore, or maybe there are better systems to deal with them, or they disappear completely, who knows. But the form that is created through that logic at that moment in time is something that will stay, ideally. So I believe the plan, the concept of a spatial configuration, ideally, is something that can last. And therefore, my celebration, so to speak, of the drawing is in fact an attempt to read more in the logic of the plan than just its functional condition. By doing so, I hope to isolate a quality that I can carry, that we can project into the future. It is expressing the trust and the fascination that this space, that this spatial configuration that is represented in these drawings is something that can survive a current use. And that brings us closer to the concept of type that stands for a principle, for a sort of an engraver, for something that is maybe the idea of a building more than the actual building. So studying plans ultimately means deciphering typological patterns, and that's what I think is interesting and also for the teaching, maybe something to be debated later. Okay, I should regain speed and just browse through these pages of this chapter on the Athens typology, as we called it. As I said, this chapter is 1 out of 4 that then were published already 5-6 years ago in this book that is called Typology, Athens, Paris, Delhi, and Sao Paulo. So it is a survey on these 4 metropolises. And actually, this was not the first we did. So there is even more plans in the first book. That was, as you might guess, here it's written on the side, Typology, Hong Kong, Rome, New York, and Buenos Aires. So in total, we did that on 8 or actually almost 9 cities. As I said in the beginning, mainly focused on the urban mass production of global cities, growing global cities, somehow culturally rooted in the European idea of a city, but like Hong Kong or also Buenos Aires, of course, under specific circumstances, developing their own, or Sao Paulo, their own independent way of building an urban habitat. And that's very interesting also in comparison. However, why are we doing that? Why, and we are still collecting plans and making plans. Why would we do that? When we published this book, that was maybe 2 years before, but all that happened since I gave my lecture at the Berlage. So to me, at least, I think it was a very seminal lecture, the one, and I believe that's the esoteric part of today's presentation. Maybe my lecture on plans in Rotterdam at the time were the sort of an impulse to what then happened. And this is just to give you the title of what we then stated in a very manifesto way, way is typology transfer towards an urban architecture, we call that. So what was the plan or what was the idea? The idea was that these examples that you see on the left-hand side that we were just looking at, these examples, they are not just interesting for academic reason or because we want to sort of produce books. They are interesting because we truly believe that we can use these buildings, or maybe not the buildings, but the plans, or maybe not the plans, but the types or some parts of it. So making architecture means creating, building up your own vocabulary, your repertoire, we could say, and then you would start to work with that. And of course, it's actually not necessarily a literal translation, but it's more a starting point for something. It's your interpretation. Nevertheless, what we then did is we created this collage that was actually an enormous panoramic image of, or picture. Actually, we called it a motion picture because it was a moving picture on a screen, a collage where we took not the plans, but the buildings that we found in these different cities. And we just somehow implanted them into the longest, most normal, I'm tempted to say perhaps also the most boring street in Zurich. The tramway in blue is typical Zurich. The brown house, the beige house on the corner, this is Zurich. It's not bad, it's very good even. But so what happens? It was more, of course, a provocation towards ourselves. What happens if we start to imagine not only a city or part of a city growing? So it's not only about densification in terms of quantities, it is also about complexification through different types. However, that was then this image that we liked a lot. And actually, and this is of course the funny thing, that's maybe why it came to my mind. It's not that I show that every lecture, so forgive me if I got a bit too nostalgic about our research, but I find it interesting because then ultimately we projected this motion, this moving picture on a 9-meter wide screen at the Rotterdam Biennale 2012. Already feels like Stone Age, but however, and it was, I think, called How We Make the City or something, or How to Make a City. And we called our projection Remaking Zurich. So that's what you see here, that we did that with our ETH team. So it is about urban architecture, understanding that, as I said, the urban artifact, the buildings that we can see, that we can describe, that we can fall in love with, are somehow the key to something which is lying behind. The urban types is maybe the methodological or theoretical means that is a very established, very, very established, almost convention in architectural theory, but that's why I find it's interesting to revise it from time to time. And it goes back to the 18th century France, but I will not make the detour or the excursus now on that theory, but we could do that maybe on another occasion. However, this is something that we felt being very inspiring, and that takes us further. So our work in progress indeed goes forward, and that's now a very current project in that tradition of typological urban research. And the title of that project is Mahala. Mahala is the term, is the name for a, let's say, social, cultural, urbanistic phenomenon in Central Asia. It's the name for an entity, a neighborhood in a city that can be found in the region of Central Asia, with its long, the Silk Road, its long history and tradition. In today's maps, you would find Uzbekistan, and that's where we went. This is Tashkent in Uzbekistan, a very interesting and strongly transforming city. You see the cranes in the back. I think it's roughly 6 million people. It's the capital of Uzbekistan. And you see there are neighborhoods, quarters like this, small alleyways, rather insignificant, perhaps less formal than some of the buildings that we were looking at in Athens, even though the logic of how it was built is pretty similar, meaning that one lot next to the other, it's more or less self-built, very simple means, always more or less the same way of building it. It's plastered, you have rendered walls. It is a mixed structure, it depends a bit on where you are. Sometimes it's brick, sometimes it's clay. In that sense, a very interesting, modest construction that also means it's typically 1-2 story high, not more than that. And once you enter in one of these houses, you would find a situation like that one. This is a courtyard, but not necessarily a very precise courtyard. It's maybe a courtyard that is created through by putting together different portions of a house. So quite a dynamic thing at second sight. Then you would go inside and we find interiors. That's a very everyday life again in this mainly Islamic society in Uzbekistan. Of course, there is a recent history of the 20th century when this traditional fabric of the city, as you can see it in the middle and background of the left-hand side of the image, sort of literally collided with new ideas brought by the Soviet already at the end of the 19th century. Russian urbanists would start to build a new type of a city, but still the Mahala, that as a social and a spatial and a cultural entity survived and continued to exist, as you can see in these very beautiful images. In the 1960s, 1966, there was an earthquake, a lot of demolition of some of also the old Soviet or Russian architecture. So then there is a movement of rebuilding the city, as you can see here. Interestingly enough, that idea of the Mahalla would also inform partly new neighborhoods that then were built only after the 60s, so up to the 70s, 80s, and they still live today. And interesting is that these neighborhoods are to become more and more wanted by the people, because all of a sudden we understand that expanding the big city, building the high-rise is probably not the only way of moving forward. So the Mahalla is something to be rediscovered. And there is different versions. There's the tradition of the Courtyard House, of course, but also, as I said, we could see this then rationally planned version of it. So that's interesting. So the traditional example becomes a type, gets reinterpreted, and put or pushed forward through the modern means of mass production in that case there, and so on. There are some drawings that we found. So the research was in a way very exciting, but also quite demanding, because we do not speak Uzbek or Russian in our team. So to establish the contacts, but these are things you know. Moving forward means also that we communicate, that we investigate, and that's something that I don't have to talk about it right now under the current circumstances. Is even a bit harder. So here you see our typological interests, the ways of representation that I was introducing in Athens. In a way, they existed already here, because of course also under the Soviet times there was a tradition of cultivating and studying these sources. Here you see the map again, that is speaking of that collision of two systems that I was mentioning before. And nowadays, and that's now where our work is based on, we have these sort of official plans that only show the lots. That's what we have. And from that, we try now to understand and to analyze and read that texture, to extract the logic of a building, and finally and ultimately understand its plans, its types. And that's what we're doing. With drones, we could fly over these stretches of the city. So it gives you an impression of this very pretty homogeneous texture, even though if you go more closely, we would find, of course, many differences. You see the courtyards, you see the overall height. Mostly the roofs are covered with corrugated steel. So there are many of these beautiful drone images, and it's quite a discovery, but there is no contemporary material on it at all. As I said, the quality of life is considered very high. We could go there then and visit. And here you see, I think from above, Stefano Zeni, who is in our team, and with a colleague of another chair at ETH. And what they are doing, they are installing their scanner, a 3D scanner that they stands in the center of the courtyard, and is collecting an endless number of digital data, so-called point clouds. As you know, this is a technology that is not rocket science anymore. It's a very practical and beautiful tool to document and photograph in a way digitally a 360-degree environment, and that is what then is a sort of a roughly filtered outcome of these scans. Now we have the only thing that cannot be registered, as you probably know, is the sky. Therefore, the sky is somehow endlessly open. And now here in this digital representation looks a bit like a post-nuclear event sky. But that's more how it is in reality. That's what we find there. So without going too much into detail, we can start to think about the relationship not only from one building to the street and to the neighbors, but also the relationship between actually the living space and the gardens and spaces of production, because there is partly production, but there is also, you see, that's our scanner on the left-hand side, I think, on the tripod. Here it stands then also in the rooms. So we could really go and discover and save also this precious information, because these buildings haven't been documented, most of them, and partly they're also transformed or replaced. So we consider that a very interesting research. We have all the data, and out of this data, this is now an ongoing process, work in progress. We are producing our documents, and here you see, I think these are the 10 mahalas that we were looking at in Tashkent. Now you see this starts to become a pattern that we are reading and trying to understand. I was saying, a bit similar to Athens, there is also more organized or less organized ways of putting these houses together, depending, of course, on the topography and when it was built. You see that there is a high percentage of green. So the greenery is a very integrated part in that type. And I find that interesting because we are discussing more and more. This is the case in Switzerland. I think it's the case in Holland. It's in Europe all over. Together with that densification that I was celebrating before, are questions raised about climate, about how to compensate what densification and urbanization is doing to our micro environment. And we are, all of us, I mean, architects in general, are trying to find ways to integrate green into their designs. That's actually a very old-fashioned way of doing it. It's high density, low rise, and high density is pretty dense, and it has a strong integration of green that is related to an idea of use. It's not decoration, it's not just a pro forma CO2 absorber. As I said, some of it is getting destroyed or replaced. That's then a mahala with a different typological pattern and so on. I don't want to lose myself too much in details, but since I promised more plans, here you see another series now of these types that we found in these mahalas. And of course, again, coming back to my introductory words on what is all hidden or kept, condensated and contained in a plan, it is always about this, what you see on the right-hand side. And I like this juxtaposition because the plan on the left is the plan, it has a degree of abstraction, and the right-hand side is still a pretty rough image that is maybe something between a drawing, a sketch, and of course a very precise digital photograph that gives us an understanding of what this courtyard is, how interior and exterior spaces are related, the small stretch of a garden where you would plant also your trees, bushes, and also fruit and vegetable. Many families have also small animals, and typically quails and other birds that make a very strong sound in these micro environments. This is something like a tabjan. This is like a bed or a sofa where you would also then sit in the shade during the day. It can be very hot in the summer. So of course, if I was a bit more precise, I would start now to try to speak about the climatic condition and also the fact that these small plots are then getting subdivided sometimes. And if a daughter or a son would get married, you add another element. So it is, as I said, not at once planned perfect house. It rather grew over time. And in that sense, it is a bit different from other examples that I was mentioning earlier. And I think this is interesting now for us, that we can learn, that we can absorb and adopt these patterns, these structures, these typological principles as well. In the end, it's of course, in that case, mostly the courtyards that we're looking at. but in so many variations, in so many different scales and compositions. The courtyard in the front, the house in the back. As you can already see from the drawing, this is a regular type. So that's a planned one. That's a rational version, or whether the previous one was a grown over time version. The stretch, the plot, the lot is very regular. So that's a rational plan, a rational overall design. Whereas others that we saw before, they were more accidental in their form. So we start only by comparing. We can understand what is the pattern, what belongs to the principle, and what's the individual specific condition. And in very short, that's the logic of describing types. It is comparing, it is following a development over time. And only by doing so, we can come to that, let's say, essence of a building. Voila, I think that's more or less what we are. There's much more information. I'm happy to share. You're the first ones to see that, I think. We shared it with our students at ETH, but not yet publicly. We are working on a book currently where we have all these different media in a very beautiful systematic way. And we will also bring that to Venice this spring in May, where then in another beautiful building by San Sovino in the Arsenale, just next to the Italian pavilion, we will then do a representation. There our research project will be presented. It will be debated and discussed, and it will be sort of showcased with an installation that we are preparing. It is a scientific, artistic portrait that we are doing together with Bas Prinsen and with a photographer from the Netherlands, whom you for sure know, and with whom we collaborate, which is a fantastic thing, and also Carlos Casas, a filmmaker and an artist living in Paris, recording sound. So there is a very interesting multi-layered portrait of that phenomenon of the Mahala that we would like to present if ever we can go to Venice. And today, as I told Salomon earlier, today the president personally of the Biennale confirmed, whatever that means, that everybody can travel to Venice, of course, under safety measures and all that. However, that's the plans that I brought from our different research. There is more plans, and maybe I call that open plans. That's like the second part of the lecture. I try to relate the academic work and the practical work. So yes, we are a research team and a teaching team at ETH. We're also a wonderful team at the office. We are an office based in Basel, where we are around 80 people working on many projects, as it has been said in the introduction. I may be a bit brutal. I only brought one project, or maybe it's two. And again, it relates to the idea of the work in progress, because it is actually a very down-to-earth operation. It's about office, research, buildings in a small campus outside the city of Basel. Where we live and work in Basel. This is, as you know, in the very north of Switzerland. So we are right on the French and the German border. And this is a town on the German side, where this pharmaceutical company has had its production plants and also part of the administration. Now it's the headquarters for the whole German part of that company. However, we were invited to make a competition project also, more or less at the time when I was at the Berlage last time. So it goes back also to around 2000 and 9, let's say, and there we found this campus that is based on the idea of a classic modernist urban pattern. I'm tempted to call it the open field or even the open plan. So it is not Athens, it's not Paris, neither is it the Mahalla in Uzbekistan. It's the more generic, the European American modern pattern of building a campus on an open field. And you see a model, you see typical buildings as then they were designed according to that idea throughout the 1940s, 50s, up to the 80s. And then many things changed. The production plant got partly reduced, and the focus and the emphasis goes to the part that is administration, the headquarters, research and development, and communication, as it is for many industrial plants and sites in European cities. This is a model that we built. It looks a bit older. And it looks a bit, I wouldn't say it's a shitty model. It's actually quite nice, but it's not very precise. And you see, this is our representation, a model that is a few years old, and you see basically boxes. So it's a collection of boxes, and you could say it's the most simple, maybe the most boring thing, but it's also the most interesting thing, how to put the box. It's very primary, that's how maybe also as a child we would start to represent buildings and to relate them to each other. And we contributed 3 boxes to that collection of boxes or objects, buildings. One is, do you see my arrow? Yes. Or shall I start to draw? No, it's a small box. That's an energy plant. They are the transformer and the post office. This is an office building that's built. That was the building I showed you in the previous photograph. That's this one. And then this here is a new building that we are working on as well, almost finished. So I'm basically speaking about these 2 buildings. The idea was to reframe this open plan of the campus, to create different interstitial spaces, a sort of a plaza, and to relate with a sort of a minimal vocabulary our buildings to this urban condition of a public yet monofunctional environment, which is this campus. And that's a very interesting problem. And I thought I choose this project for the discussion. So it's not necessarily a fancy museum. It is more the everyday, it's the normal. And I thought it goes maybe well with the settlements in a Central Asian city like Tashkent, even though there is no courtyard, but there's maybe some other kind of ordinary things. It goes certainly well with Athens and the Domino System. So somehow to try to find the specific quality in the modern project and its types and its plans. That's maybe the topic of that second part. That's why I called it open plans. Since I guess we all know, in a nutshell, modernism is about the plan libre. And this idea of freedom and liberty then also comes with free movement by cars and all the disastrous things that followed. But I would make the case that the free plan, in this case, the box, is still a very, very beautiful ambition in architecture. That's then the building we finished, I think, in the 2011 or so. So it's almost 10 years, perhaps. Yeah, nearly 10 years. It's our monumental reaction to the most banal principle of modernism, the column and the slab. And as you can see, and here now maybe it gets physical again, because ultimately it's not about the plan, it's about the building, if I may say. I am a scholar of plans, perhaps, but I'm also a builder. We believe in buildings, And we are very privileged and happy and proud that we can contribute buildings to our environment. Here we did that with these 3 slabs or 4 slabs. And as you can see, this is, of course, a celebration again of these few things that make this building. The fragile, slim column, and let's say the heavy band, the ribbon, the slab, the corpus of a white concrete horizontal slab. If we try to understand how it works, we understand that every slab is slightly different. So it's not just the generic repetitions, or maybe different from a economical, pragmatic Athens type. It is quite ambitious work about that relationship. Can we repeat the almost same but not exactly same element in order to create the cohesion and something like a whole, and not just a series that could potentially be endless? So it was about how to start and to end an order of repetition, amongst other things. This is the plan. Quite an insignificant plan. This is, to me, not a negative description, but it has almost uncontested coherent logic of a course in the center that will carry the load and take on all the infrastructural elements, and 1 row of columns running around. So that's pretty much maybe intelligent. At least it makes sense and almost a bit conventional. There is one thing though, and you see it on the right-hand side, there the rhythm of the column change. We see the line where the facade stops and the naked slab continues. So this is not a big thing, and it's not the courtyard of Tashkent, but it is the version of an additional space in an open plan that we convinced the client to build, even though the client thought he might not need it. This is an open loggia, a little bit, and it's almost like a mathematical scheme. I don't know, you could measure it, 20% maybe of the floor plate that we would give to an external space that is an informal space within the formality of the design, a space that belongs partly to the public square, that intersects with an axis that is at the in the grid of the main axis, the sort of the cardo of the industrial layout of that site. So this little loggia, this is the ambition, that's the promise, can take on a multi-layered, more complex function, because it belongs to the city, if I speak it or if I describe it as such, as it belongs to the building and to the users inside. And indeed, at least now it's very, very cold, but for many, many moments throughout the year, it's used and very actually intensively used by the people. That was, of course, as architects sometimes do, the photographs when the open plan is also an empty plan. In terms of design, in terms of aesthetics, we tried to make the typological structural principle very clear, saying that the black and the white is the essence, and then somehow this carpet that is laid out in the floor is something that changes. It stands sort of for the, it's almost a bit Dutch, and I thought it's maybe nice also to bring in a bit of orange, but forgive me this slightly stupid, bad joke. Anyhow, this is then the floors, how it looked, open with these glass boxes where you would go for a meeting also. In the new building, the old building is reflected. A new building, especially when it is directly referring also to the tradition, and I would even say the vocabulary, the forms of modernism, it reflects, of course, its neighbors and their tradition. In that sense, I like that picture because it also speaks about that relationship in a very explicit and artistic way. However, as you could see on the model, the two boxes, as I called them, or the two buildings, here seen from a strange angle, slightly from above, is just a step in a work in progress. And we do progress with another building that is now under construction. I think this is somehow a picture taken from the crane when they started to prepare the site. The idea is a building, to imagine this house, this building, as, yes, an industrial functional building. If you look at the proportions, you would start to see that is also compared, this is a rendering, but still, compared to the neighboring building, it is quite generous in dimensions and proportions. So I'm tempted to say now the design metaphors that we sometimes use are still in vigor. So I'm speaking of a sort of an industrial palazzo, something that has a dignity and even a representation, an idea of representation with its facades. But we also see the crosses. We understand that there is structurally happening something at the edge of the building. And then, at least to us, this is extremely important. And it has to do with the plan maybe and the openness of a plan. The corners are open. So this hermetic box opens up. And this is not a stylistic feature. It is a typological feature. It has to do with the fact that in the center of the building, there is nothing. And as you can guess in this second view, the structural elements, the infrastructural elements, they are sitting in the corner where then the space is changing. In a more abstract representation, we would see it in an elevation drawing, a ground floor with 4 floors above, the short facade on the side to that plaza, facing the first building that we were just looking at. So the horizontal bands, almost a bit of a signature element of modernism, as we could see it in Athens, is coming back in that building again. In section, it's getting a bit more complex, but still it's very basic. We have a double height space in the very core, in the center of the building for kind of a forum that is a big meeting room. Actually, the whole building is not an office building really. And that's also why I thought it's maybe interesting to speak about that today when we are all sitting in our home, or most of us sitting in our home office. What is an office building today? Is it still, I mean, the design goes back before Corona. And already the brief was to imagine a building that is actually in the first place, a building where we can meet. So it was sort of called the meeting room building or the convention or conference hall building. But then the longer we were discussing, the longer we were speaking, the less it was clear what exactly is now the ideal office building nowadays, before the pandemic. How much do we have to integrate teams? How much do you want to work together? Does it need cells, retreat spaces? Yes, it does, but how many? Do we need big auditoria? How stable, how static is a working environment? How dynamic should it be? How social can it possibly be? And then, of course, throughout the discussions or the experience we all made with the pandemic, we understand that probably a good part of working activities, I don't know whether they should, but they could at least be removed from campus, sadly, also in universities, but that's a different discourse. We might speak about that a bit later. And it can be displayed, it can be transferred to home. But some other activities, meeting, exchanging, socializing, getting annoyed, getting inspired, being attacked, being forgotten, I don't know. This happens only when you are somewhere where there is a social, inspiring environment. And so that office building, that meeting building, this conference building, whatever it is, should allow for that. It's many words for a very simple drawing. This is the plan, this is the structure, this is the load-bearing structure, even though I have to say this, the walls on the side where the staircases sit, They don't even carry a load. They are not stiffening the structure either. That's the crosses in the facade. They're just holding the stairs. So it's a very minimalistic plan. It's probably the end of all possible plans you can draw. I was speaking about the celebrations of columns. There is not much more left. So that's the ultimate open plan that we then created for this building. If we give a bit more information, then of course you would see that there are lifts also on the 4 sides, but literally it's a house that is working on the 4 open corners, and the rest should be as open as possible. Still, you can see there can be more or less conventional furniture, but basically, and this is again not something that we invented, but that's the funny and the sad and the great thing about architecture. In the end, we could describe that as an open space layout from the 1970s. We could say it's a loft. Basically, the ideal type is probably just the warehouse or the parking lot that I was showing you in Athens. That's the ultimate sustainable building, because there is wide spans, a solid structure, and it can stand for a long time. And this is super simple. It's a sort of a banal bottom line statement, but I'm pretty close to this conclusion that good buildings are durable in many ways when they allow for that generosity and unspecificity of the structure, I have to say. But then what gets very specific is the whole development of these interiors. And that's something that we could then develop together with not only our wonderful team in Basel in the office of Christ Gantenbein, but also with friends of ours who are furniture makers and interior designers. Inch Furniture are they called, and this is great people. And we started to go test things, and now I was celebrating the plans and the drawings, and I would like to, rather than end with building, as I said, and building models is a very important part of our work. So we tested then here the big open floor that then all of a sudden is not so big anymore. And the plants are coming back that we saw in the Mahalla. We saw the curtains, we saw intimate spaces, we saw experiments on how dense could we go. And all of a sudden the urbanism that we saw earlier is maybe also potentially present under the grid of this waffle structure, actually this very beautiful structure that is load bearing in 2 directions. The furniture itself is maybe part of architecture. So it's like informal architecture inside our urban layout. That is the rigorous frame, the rigorous generous frame for that development. And here you see we were then developing, our partners were developing the furniture, these elements. I don't know, is it a case study house within our building? Is it just a piece of furniture? It goes further, this is a prototype. So we started to look at these things in the scale 1:1, movable office desks. So it's a speculation about the informality of the working environment. And I feel that this is pretty to the point when we're looking at how we have to adopt and adapt every day and new circumstances. And of course, then that model is quite big, and that's the workshop. Sort of the ideal office is actually the workshop, we could say. Here then, when we just pile it up as a staple, and that's also actually how the structure works. It's a working tool. I mean, you know what models are. I just can encourage that we still stick to the models, the physical models, because in the end, they come closest to what it means when you build it. Actually, the structure is up. Under construction still. So Solomon, we go back again to the tradition of that lecture. I'm sorry. Here you see how this wonderful structure is produced. Of course, there is digital models too, because the integration of all the technical layers of mechanical, etc. And that's how it stands. It's approaching the end. The open plan is there. Of course, every open plan is there to be filled in with all these things. That is also part of architecture that I like a lot, and here you see the distribution of the pipes and all that. But the essence is the plan. That's now the true last version that you got to know. This is the last plan I show in this lecture, and I think I close with that. The promise for more open plans is there. Thank you very much for your attention. Now I'm open for discussion or critical statements. Please attack.
Well, thank you, Emanuel, for a great lecture. So I think, Anna, you had the first question.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, we hear you perfect.
Yes.
Hello, Manuel.
Hi, Anna.
Hello. This is Anna from Spain. I say hello from Spain. Thank you for the lecture. So I was thinking mostly in the first part of your lecture, when you were using terms such as fascination, observation, beauty, pragmatism, words that somehow we don't listen like anymore among new generations of architects, at least in Spain. So I wanted to thank you first for bringing those terms, fascination. But my question, concrete question, would be, how do you see the relation between the urban artifacts you design and the more like inner logic of the projects, or in a more practical way, how do you work the two scales in parallel, the urban artifact embedded in the city and this inner logic of an existing type?
Thank you. Thanks for your comment and also your question. And maybe just, you know, also coming back maybe to some terms or qualities that are not so much in fashion. I think bottom line is curiosity. Curiosity is what is needed, and curiosity leads to fascination and vice versa, and that's what we have to keep up. But that's clear. For your question, how if I'm correct, and please interrupt me, Zoom is always so well portioned, and one speaks and the other watches, so please feel free to just jump in.
Maybe we can go, maybe if you stop screen sharing, you'll
sorry,
see everybody.
Yeah, I see everybody. That's a good.
Yeah, that's easier. Yeah, thank you.
Yes, thank you, Salon. So yeah, hey, hi everyone. Yeah, sure. You were hidden on the side of my screen down there. So good to see you all. But Anna, yeah, for the question, also how we deal and how we work with that double relationship, sort of the condition of the urban condition of a given site and an environment on the one hand, and let's say the inner logic that comes maybe from a typological principle or a formal or a spatial or a structural intention, so to speak. And I have to admit that, or confess that now in that example of the modern campus, I was not cheating. This is an authentic story, but it's maybe the most, no, in a way it's maybe the most difficult case, but it's also a very easy case, because there is a very rational and sort of strong coherence between the urban layout and the types of the buildings, with all their qualities and also maybe their shortcomings, because these self-referential square objects, they are communicating with their neighbors, but they have also a sort of a limit to themselves, because they are symmetrical. They have a sort of introverted or inwards oriented logic to a certain extent. I find that on the roots, on the grounds of an industrial site that is following the law since more than 100 years, actually, in that specific site, following the logic of a rational production line, somehow it makes sense. It's the DNA of the site. And to your question, we interpreted in one case, that was the one with the loggia, our simple box as something that then had to be oriented towards that one side with the loggia. So it's maybe very basic, but I believe it is a possible answer to your question. So that on the one hand, there is the principle as such, and on the other hand, it's the forces or the hierarchies or the hierarchical structure of an urban pattern. I could also take Athens and speak about the street and the backyard. And the regular domino system starts to develop one face to the street and rather the back to the yard. And you start to step back on the street side because the sunlight should reach the center of the street. So all of a sudden, it's very practical, you know. And the first building I showed is somehow in an almost minimal art-like way is doing this. The second one is a bit more tricky, and it has to do with the fact it's more tricky because it doesn't react so clearly to one side. It is not fully, if you would go closer, but it is actually symmetrical in two directions. Of course, there is a main entrance to the north, to the street, but still it is a very symmetrical building. We did do that, and therefore it's a perfect type. And the perfection maybe comes or leads to a certain beauty, but it's also a question whether this leads to a certain hermetic nature of the building, because it doesn't speak so clearly with the surrounding. But we took that decision because according to our urban strategy, this is the central building. It's the central building of the whole campus. And that's why we found it so important that we open it up on the corner, that we break the hermetics at that point. Maybe this is a bit, how to say, literal or a bit conceptual, but I believe it works pretty well when you're there. And now you can start to see it. But and then in other cases, and then you should cut me short because otherwise I speak forever for this. By the way, I should say, since you are in Spain, I don't know where you are in Spain. Where are you?
Madrid.
Excellent. I gave a lecture in Madrid. That was the time when lecturing meant you would travel and you have time and you're excited about traveling, and then you have time to prepare, and then you sit in a shitty hotel room and you prepare your lecture. And then I gave a lecture that was in Madrid, and Rafael Moneo did attend the lecture, which was really nice. And I also showed these two buildings, but the second one was only a plan. It was not that's of course at that stage. And after the lecture, and somehow this is maybe related to your question, but he didn't ask a question, he gave the answer straight away. Yeah. He said he liked the Loggia building very much, but he was more skeptical about the other one because that relationship could be not strong enough to the surrounding urban space, even though it is this industrial urban space. However, but we have other examples. We did the Kunstmuseum in Basel, where the form of the building, even its typological structure, is directly sort of created out of the condition of a site, its geometry. But that's maybe then something, I don't know. The good thing is today, these lectures, I mean, you know, we have a website, you can, while we are speaking, you can go and check on that, and you see beautiful plans, more plans on that on the website as well. So maybe we can refer to that later. However, there's for other questions, or was that an answer to the question? Or
yes,
not?
yes. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, I also had a question. So, Jin, I actually studied interior design and practiced before coming here. So that last few images that you showed were quite interesting. Those, especially those upper floors, you don't see that kind of layout much anymore. It's definitely something, I don't know, dated is the right term, but something I learned in school but haven't seen in person. But so I was introducing myself to your work because I hadn't, and like new to architecture a bit, and I kept noticing the term flexibility and the concept of flexibility a lot, and I was curious kind of curious to hear a little more in detail what you were thinking of when working with that concept.
Yes, first, I'm happy to hear that you have the background or a first part of your experience and education of interior design, because what I really liked, and the complete truth is I didn't prepare that line, but when I was reading the project now together with you and speaking about it, the analogy to urbanism is obvious, no? So that in the end, I don't believe that there is interior and exterior design. It's in a way all the same. I mean, of course, there is a question of scales, and especially in the example I showed, somehow it's the urbanization, the temporary urbanization of such a flora that is the interior design, and it follows similar patterns. And to the flexibility, yes, I mean, I find flexibility somehow a horrible word, and nevertheless, it seems that we should rather speak of openness, because it's open to future different uses. With flexibility, it's like flex. It's like something that that you bend, and it's elastic and it's undecided, but flexibility, every client wants to hear flexibility, and right so, because ideally a building binds so many resources, so much money, so much thinking. It occupies a space on our planet. So yes, we better build something, even though maybe it doesn't have to last for 100 years, as we claimed in other cases. But even if it lasts for, I don't know, 2 decades, 4 decades, it's almost impossible to conceive something I'm speaking of a building of a certain scale, that to conceive it in a way that it is allowing for development, because society is changing, as we can see now. It's university education is changing, everything is changing, and this is not a statement against form. It's not a statement against a strong materiality. It's not, openness doesn't exclude a very clear proportion. So openness is a conceptual term. It even allows for columns, by the way. It doesn't have to be free span. But I think
because it was interesting.
Certain dimension.
I found it interesting that you also found this tiny room with a central piece, which is kind of opposite of what you would consider open. So fascinating. It's I was a little curious about what. Wouldn't
you say that one plan that I was so much making a big fuss about, this one with the one column, is that's a question? I'm not pretending to know better than you do. But is this an open plan, or is this not an open plan?
I would maybe say it depends on the scale of it. From this look of it, it looks very small for maybe only for one person to occupy. I think that's a little tougher.
That's small.
To be open.
It's an office floor where maybe 10 people could work.
Oh, really? Okay.
Very tiny toilet, though. Yeah. But I see. I believe in terms of maybe also significance or almost the symbolic or semantic value of architecture. What is a column is there because it might be needed, otherwise the floor wouldn't hold the slab. But when it's there, it's also a sign. It does also say something, and it says I'm occupying the space. And in that sense, I'm totally with you. It is the opposite attitude from the last building that I showed you, where we tried to put everything to the corners and to free that sort of public space in the center of the building. In that sense, it's the opposite gesture. I agree, because it's of course. It has to do with occupation also in terms of the significance, of a meaning of a space. Yeah.
I have a question. So, my name is Han. I'm from Taiwan, and I was so fascinated by those photographs you took in Athens and in Uzbekistan, because I saw like a extension of plans. So, for example, there's like additional building on the balcony or on the rooftop in Athens, or like in these Mahala neighborhoods, when like the son or the daughter, they had a family, they all like expand their houses. And I think perhaps this is like a talk about this openness in the building. What do you see this kind of like not just like hosting different activities in one space or in one plan, but like this plan can keep growing, and there's like an organic layout of them.
I mean, you know, I think, to me, conceptually, if I think you gave also very beautiful and precise observation, I think, on things that you saw and that you're reflecting upon. So maybe a question or a possible maybe also critical thought that I take from your question and your remark is that I believe we all, correct me if I'm wrong, but somehow at least I feel, and I feel it also with Christoph and our whole teams, we feel so much attracted by, let's say, informal settlements, by things that grow. And I mean, and that's now a bit a philosophical question. I'm not really prepared and into it. You know, the analogy or the relationship between nature and culture and architecture. And this is not just a metaphor. I think there is a certain analogy between how a neighborhood could grow and how an organic, natural environment would grow. So there we can speak maybe of a certain analogy. And like we are maybe amazed and impressed by the beauty of nature, we can also be impressed by the beauty or the evidence or the spontaneity of an informal settlement, for instance, for these courtyards, these houses that grew over time. And you could also go here in Switzerland to the mountains and you would find old farmhouses where then at a certain point somebody added, and we know that from all over the planet. So what I'm trying to say is that there is an inner truth to these informal constructions. And perhaps then the question, can we as designers learn from these informal structures and the processes? Is it possible? And this is maybe not, it's a philosophical question, it's a conceptual question. Can we create and describe patterns, strategies, plans ultimately that reach the quality of such an unplanned sort of coming into existence of a neighborhood, of a house, of a whole city? And I find that a very interesting problem. And there have always been attempts throughout architecture history, I believe, where there was more or less successful, but also successful ways from learning from the vernacular is a big topic, as you know. There is romanticism in urbanism. No, there is movements in the 19th century where city planners tried to recreate and imitate or put forward ideas of spaces that resemble spaces that grew in villages and small towns in the Middle Ages. There is a modern movement. We also, as I told you, I unfortunately I couldn't show everything, but we did also these studies in Delhi in India. That was actually absolutely fantastic. There was a strong focus, not all of it, but a strong focus was on big housing developments from the 1940s, when in 1947 India got independent, and there was a new program of providing everyone a house or a place to live, or a big number of people who then also migrated because of that dramatic and a kind of horrible end of a conflict where half of Pakistan would go to India and vice versa. However, in Delhi, being in the north, there were huge developments, and I could even meet and speak with architects from that at the time. Like Kuldeep Singh, for example, and we were sitting in his house, modern architect. They built in concrete endlessly, you know, clusters, villages, towns, fantastic things. And he was living in a house surrounded by fragments of old traditional houses, wooden doors and all that. He has his collection. And he told me how at the time he and his colleagues, young architects, were studying the vernacular patterns of old North Indian settlements and how they tried to translate that into a rational system of a modular design where they were creating whole neighborhoods. And the mahalla, by the way, that I showed, maybe I was a bit quick on that. We saw the very organic ones and the ones you were referring to, where it really grew over time, unplanned. But there were, for instance, in the 60s and 70s, there were, or even before, I think in the 50s even, there were modern versions of it. Again, with courtyards, with clusters, with a certain intimacy. And this is that's a topic that goes through modern architecture, how to learn from the vernacular. Can we reproduce that? Is it working or is it sterile? Is it true or is it an imitation that doesn't work? And I find that it's not an easy question. Is it manneristic? Is it romantic? But what's the essence of vernacular architecture? Can it be translated into a type? And that brings us back to chapter 1 of the lecture, in a way, no? I don't know whether this was an answer to your question, forgive me, but I was inspired by your inspiration, by your observation on that question of natural growth, you know. But please insist if you have an after question to that. I don't want you.
Yeah, I think one thing confused me or concerned me is that it is a little bit nostalgia to just trying to mimic or reproduce this kind of pattern or spaces, but yeah, so I think this could be like a cultural or philosophical question.
Yes, of course. I mean, you know, also this Mahalla survey, this is the first place it was, again, it was curiosity. I went to Uzbekistan for another reason, and then I saw these neighborhoods, and it was just extremely interesting, perhaps also because it was new or unexpected. Sometimes this is also a bit emotional, or it happens in the moment. And only a good bit later, we were asked and invited by Uzbekistan to do their first national participation at the Biennale in Venice. And we said we would accept to do that if we can do it as a scientific project. So not just a sort of let's say a sales or a roadshow that shows just the beauty of the country, which of course exists, is fantastic, also great tradition. But we were interested by this very everyday condition of these vast, big neighborhoods. And first, the Ministry of Culture was a bit shocked, you know, that this sort of everyday could be interesting for a global community. And we said, look, the topic of the Biennale is how we will live together, one of these big questions, or how will we live together? And I'm not saying the Mahalla is the good model for that, but I think it's a very interesting proposition in the current discourse that goes beyond Central Asia, I think, because I believe many of the things that we were also describing in our typology collections, like Hong Kong, Buenos Aires, New York, you know, it comes to its limits. At some point, it cannot go on like that. And I'm not saying we should go back to the Mahalla or to other vernacular things, and this is a bit addressing your discomfort or irritation. I don't have the answer, but I think, or I'm convinced that it must be productive to look at other things, you know, to think back maybe whether integration with gardens. I mean, it sounds extremely modest, but it could be absolutely productive if we maybe extract something and you extract something else than I would or somebody else. So, and this is maybe the good thing and the important thing about academic work. You are putting forward a question, an observation, maybe a hypothesis, but you are not obliged to give an all-over solution, but you can set an impulse. And that, I think, what we can do. And then strangely, what you do yourself, what I do in my practice, what we do in our practice is related to our research directly sometimes, and sometimes very indirectly. And I'm not claiming that the second part of the lecture is directly linked to the first part. Somehow it is, but that's also a question to you. Huh? How strongly are then these things? We have to, that's also something you learn with time. Sometimes things find themselves after a while, even if you thought there was no intention, you know.
Is there one final question?
I have a question. Hi, good evening from The Hague. My name is Michael, and I have a question about representation, actually. I like that throughout your presentation you showed there were books, there were photographs of models, and there were finally, or quite at the beginning of your lecture, these point clouds, which you showed, right? The point clouds you took in Tashkent. I'm just curious, in this process of, let's say architects, they make a design, they make a model, and then afterwards there's a building that tries to mimic these renders, right? And then maybe after building has been made, there's a photographer that comes in, maybe chooses these same angles and recreates these renderings once again. And some photographers are really skillful in this, in removing all optical distortion from the lens, getting everything very crisp in an almost digital manner. I'm just curious how this laser scanner as a new medium, or let's say a relatively new medium, which is, like you said, not rocket science anymore, it's within our reach. Being able to create such accurate models once again, but then in a digital atmosphere after the fact, after the build has gone. I don't know. It's not really a question, more of a question to you. If you could reflect maybe on this process of what this new medium allows you to do. Maybe also looking ahead towards this exhibition you will have in Venice. I mean, I assume that these point clouds will play a significant role in this exhibition there once again, right?
You made a very interesting sort of reflection, and luckily you ended, not luckily, it would have been beautiful as such, but you ended with a very concrete question at the end. I'm not ready really to already show, since it's also in preparation, that what we will do, but I can tell you there will be not a point cloud in the exhibition. So there is, it will be an installation, and there is photography, but Bas Prinsen, being a super, let's say, innovative photographer, he was interested to look at these point clouds, and he was speaking about, it's intriguing, what does that mean to the media photography? But it was not him to take these point clouds scans. So his work is still, he also came with us to Uzbekistan, and he took pictures also with different cameras. But the point cloud, in that sense, it won't play a central role in the presentation to the public, because I also think we should be careful, but that's a personal opinion, we should not delegate too much of let's say, communication or content to the media, because then you see the point cloud. And for all those who didn't see them 100 times yet, it's super fascinating, because you can, of course, you can do everything, and it's absolutely, I had even more material that is mind-blowing, because it's like sketches. We will do a publication there, it will be point clouds, because it's also good archival material. But I don't claim it's the new aesthetics of architecture. I don't think that yes, as you said, after the fact, our representation of architecture should resemble the digital models from beforehand. I also believe that the physical model, not out of nostalgia, but really out of, let's say, a concern about quality, is still a media that is, we cannot just dismiss, we cannot give it away. We really still build huge models. The point cloud, to end with that, is a fantastic tool that I must admit, I even didn't really know about that so much in detail. And then we had the problem that we had a limited time in Tashkent, and then we had these scanners, and it's just fantastic. And in the old days, or before, or when we were in Hong Kong with our typological research, we would go to archives. Yes, we would go to the staircases where you have the fire escape plans, you know, and then you take a picture, and then maybe you measure some width and length, and then at home you reconfigure more or less the plan. With the point cloud, we have a different, of course, density of information, and we were fascinated by the sketchy nature of it. But it can be a bit of a pitfall, and maybe that's what I can say. At this, but technically speaking, it's quite impressive. Yeah, but not all my hope lies in point clouds.
So you won't be buying a Leica system with your office anytime soon, then, to integrate it into your workflow.
No, I mean, of course, you know, we are also producing renderings and of course the tools, and then but that's another discussion. I mean, I don't know how much, you know, as I said, with one leg we are this, let's say, scientific curiosity and trying out new things, and then we are producing, if I may say, we are an office designing buildings of also sometimes of a certain dimension and a certain degree of complexity, and then there's this whole, as I believe, wrong obsession with coordination thanks to digital tools like all these modelings, and I'm not so sure about these things, and yeah, I'm rather skeptical in the end. But that's not a question of age, I believe. I think it's just, I think it might shift the focus into a rather problematic direction. Yeah. But I don't want to end on a note on a shitty digital tool. I'm sorry, but which is the BIM model. The point clouds are beautiful. I don't know, Salomon, do you or Michael, do you want to add something, or?
No, it's interesting. I'm curious. I was just curious how you personally look at this technology. If you indeed, some people see this as the holy grail of digitization, and this will change the way we perceive everything.
It's fancy and it's beautiful to look at, no doubt. I was freaking out when I saw the first, but don't know. Keep cool. Let's not forget about the content. But we all love to look at nice things, and we are trying to find representations. In that sense, it's fine. However, thanks a lot for your questions and your statements.
Thank you.
Well,
thank you for your answer.
Thank you for the lecture, and thank you for thank you for joining us this evening. I think we're gonna cut the live stream now. Well, round of applause. I guess this is, I don't know. I guess we should be doing, what is this, whatever these are, reactions, right?
No. You should,
you
should unmute yourself and clap hands. That would
unmute
yourself if you want to. You don't have to. Right?
Yeah,
I do it as well. Thank you.